Today's learning goals are to describe the causes and consequences of soil degradation and take a look at some methods of conservation. As you can see, guys, by the length of the note paper, these notes are a little bit longer than normal, so I'm going to try to get through them a little bit quicker than I usually would. If it seems like I'm just reading what comes up on the screen, that's why. Let's talk real quick here about soil ecosystems. So, fertile soil, not only does it have the necessary nutrients required for plant growth, but it also contains a community of organisms that work to maintain functioning nutrient cycles. So if we think about the humus layer that forms on the surface of soils, without the complex communities of soil organisms, that humus would never decompose and it would never get recycled into its nutrients, which then can be used again by plants that grow on the surface of the soil. These communities also help keep the soil resistant to erosion. The roots of plants and trees that grow on the surface of soils grow down through the layers of the soil and they tend to hold it together. Remember that fertile soils require significant time to develop, and we call this process succession. And in ecological succession, soil communities become more diverse and resilient. So the amount and type of organisms, the biodiversity of an ecosystem increases as time passes and ecological succession continues. Also, as ecological succession proceeds forward, more nutrients are added to the soil and the soil becomes more fertile. And of course, the more fertile a soil is, the more nutrients it has, and the more these nutrients are available to organisms that grow on and in the soil. Having fertile soil is a necessity, really, for all life on Earth, and 100% it's necessary for humans because we rely on it for agricultural uses. If we lack ample amounts of fertile soil, we're going to have a hard time producing food for our human population. So this diagram should look pretty familiar, guys. It's a representation of primary succession. Remember, this starts with barren rock and it ends up with a climax community of a fairly diverse ecosystem. This process, all the way from bare rock to a climax community, can take up to 150 years. And it's also estimated that just to produce 1 inch of fertile soil takes up to 100 years. And this is one of the reasons why it's so important that once we have a fertile soil in a particular location, that it's preserved and it's not degraded. So let's make sure we can describe the relationship between soil fertility and succession. So we can think of soil degradation as the loss or depletion of fertile soils, and we're going to take a look at some of the main causes of soil degradation. The first one here is erosion. So wind and water can remove the upper layers of soil, which of course is going to reduce the fertility. And what we're talking about here is the O layer. Remember, the O stands for organic. So when we're talking about erosion, we're talking about any process that takes away the top of the soil. And this primarily occurs only when there's no vegetation covering the top of the soil, because then it becomes more susceptible to water, which of course washes away the soil. And you can also have wind erosion, which simply blows the soil away. Some of the side effects of erosion include dirty air, aka dust, also reduced water quality and flooding. You can see here a pretty good example of some erosion along a shoreline. We've got no vegetation covering this part of the shoreline, and every time the waves creep up here, it washes away some of the soil. Also, anytime it rains, you're going to have a lot of that soil being washed away. You can see it building up here in the water, this brown color. We should make sure we can explain how the two types of erosion lead to soil degradation. Soil degradation can prevent or alter natural succession if it occurs during that process. Also, it can reduce soil fertility and disrupt the soil ecosystem. It's estimated that an area equal to about 1.5 times the continental United States, which is about 5 million square kilometers, is classified as having damaged ecosystem structure due to soil degradation caused by wind erosion only. So that's just wind erosion, guys. When you include the soil degradation caused by water erosion, it increases to about 16 million square kilometers. So if we take a look at this map here, we can see the extent of some of this issue. You can consider the red to be very degraded soil, and you can consider the yellow to be degraded soil, and everything else is either stable soil or soil that is without vegetation. So if you add up the red and the yellow, you should come up with your roughly 16 million square kilometers of degraded soil. So think about it, guys, real quick. Suggest a possible consequence of global soil degradation. What we're going to do now is take a look at some anthropogenic activities that contribute to soil degradation. First one we've got here is deforestation, which is the complete removal of forest cover on a soil. Of course, we talked about how removing the vegetation from the top of a soil can lead to erosion, and it can also disrupt succession. There's different types of deforestation, including simply the removal of trees of an area to the complete removal of all vegetation. So as the vegetation is removed, the soil becomes more susceptible to erosion. And of course, if you think about it, the more vegetation that is removed, the worse the problem is most likely going to be. And since most forests tend to be located in rather wet locations, the type of erosion that's most prevalent is going to be your water erosion. So this happens not only because what we talked about, the roots of these plants actually tend to hold the soil together, but also simply having soil covered by a canopy of leaves, the tops of the trees, all the leaves up there, they tend to deflect the water and slow it down so it doesn't impact the soil as hard. So this can also disrupt the hydrologic cycle in these forested areas, because once you take the trees out, you're taking out a lot of the evapotranspiration that would have occurred. And remember what that is. That is the process of the plants uptaking the water and sending it back into the atmosphere via their leaves, the openings in their leaves, the stomata. So once you take those trees away, you get a lot more water that's just going to sit in an area or be run off and increase the size and strength of a lot of the streams in an area. Here we've got a picture of deforestation. This is a clear-cut forest, and this could potentially lead to soil degradation. Make sure you're able to explain how deforestation could lead to soil degradation. Moving on, we've got another cause of soil degradation, which is called overcropping. So overcropping is the continuous production of crops without allowing the soil to recover. Overcropping depletes the soil of nutrients and makes the soil dry and susceptible to wind erosion. This can be especially problematic in areas that are already dry to begin with. During the 1930s in the American Great Plains, an area that spanned all the way from Nebraska through to Texas suffered a major period of wind erosion known as the Dust Bowl. Now, the causes of the Dust Bowl were mainly dry weather and overuse of the land. And in the Dust Bowl, soil could have been moved by the winds up to thousands of kilometers. You can see here a picture representing overcropping. We've got crops growing in rows. In between the rows, we've got dry, cracked land that most likely, when these crops are gone, is going to be highly susceptible to wind erosion. Make sure we can explain how overcropping can lead to soil degradation. Next, we're going to take a look at how irrigation can contribute to soil degradation. The first thing we've got here is that intense irrigation can remove upper soil layers. This can be done by either washing the soil away as the water is applied before it's percolated down into the soil. Also, the smaller grains in the upper layers of the soil can be washed down deeper into the subsequent layers, so they're lost from the upper layers of the soil. In a lot of areas, the irrigation water that's used to water crops actually comes from the land that the water is then applied back onto. So this process of continually washing the same water onto a patch of agricultural land can lead to something that we call salinization. Irrigation water can have a lot of salts and minerals dissolved in it, and when this irrigation water is sprayed onto crops, the minerals dissolved in the irrigation water can remain in the top layer of the soil, and they can form a hard, salty crust. Now, this salty crust can make the land unsuitable for growing crops, because what you end up with is you have all the salts and minerals that would be down in the soil located on the very top surface. This makes that upper layer of the soil extremely salty, and it can lead to reduced productivity. This picture shows a type of irrigation called surface irrigation, where water is applied and distributed directly over the soil surface, and it flows through the rows of crops by gravity. This is by far the most common form of irrigation practice around the world, and you can see just by the action of the water moving across the surface of the soil that it can lead to intense erosion and removal of important soil nutrients. We should make sure we can explain how irrigation leads to soil degradation. Moving on, the next anthropogenic activity that can cause soil degradation is overgrazing. Overgrazing occurs when too much livestock grazes in the same area for a long period of time. This removes the vegetation that can cover the top of the soil, and it can leave bare patches where roots no longer hold the soil together. This causes increased erosion and leads to a process called desertification. Desertification is just what it sounds like. It's the process by which fertile land becomes desert over time. So in drier areas, after the vegetation is removed removed by the livestock, it's wind erosion that's going to cause a huge problem. In wetter areas, the main problem is going to be water erosion. Make sure you can explain how overgrazing leads to soil degradation. Moving on, we're going to take a closer look at desertification. So as we said, areas of existing deserts can become enlarged due to human activities at the edges. Oftentimes, the edges of deserts are utilized to grow crops, and if we have the size of the desert increasing because of some of these anthropogenic activities caused with the dry climate, this can lead to crop failure, malnutrition, and famine. Similar to overgrazing, this can leave bare patches in the soil where the roots of the vegetation that has been lost can no longer hold the soil together. Rain and wind then can increase the size of the bare patches and remove soil from the area. A prime example of desertification happened in the Sahel area of Africa. This is a thin strip of land that separates the Sahara Desert from the Great African Savanna. In the late 1970s and mid to early 1980s, this area was extremely overgrazed by cattle. At the same time, it was going through an intense drought. These two factors strongly reduced the growth of vegetation in this area. This resulted in the death of most of the cattle that were grazing here. It also resulted in an extreme famine. Make sure we can explain how desertification leads to soil degradation. Our next anthropogenic activity is urbanization. As you might have guessed, urbanization is the movement of humans from rural to urban areas. Now, since land in cities is paved with concrete and buildings are built upon it, it removes it as a source of agricultural land in order to increase the size of the city. And if you just think about the area in which we're living right now, guys, think about all of the development in this area over the last several years. Since concrete and asphalt tend to be impervious to water, this changes the water runoff, which may increase soil erosion outside the city. Make sure we can explain a couple reasons how urbanization leads to soil degradation. Moving on, we're going to take a look at some unsustainable agricultural techniques that can lead to soil degradation. These are all techniques that reduce soil fertility over time, and once the soil has reduced fertility, it requires an increased input of chemicals, which in turn increases pollution. So it's kind of like a vicious cycle. One unsustainable agricultural technique is the total removal of crops after they're harvested. This leaves the soil open to erosion. Another technique that can lead to soil degradation is growing crops with gaps of loose soil in between them. This can also lead to erosion, as we've already seen. Another thing that can lead to erosion and soil degradation is plowing parallel in the direction of a slope. If the land has a slight incline or decline and the soil is plowed parallel to that slope, this creates channels for the water to run through, and it can lead to erosion. Another thing is the excessive use of pesticides. In the long run, this can make soil too toxic for further agricultural use, and it's called toxification. We've already talked about how irrigation can lead to the process of salinization. This is exacerbated in warm, dry areas where the irrigated water tends to dissolve before it percolates into the soil. And this is how we can end up with that salty, mineralized crust on the top of the soil. Monocultures have also been proven to be an unsustainable agricultural technique, and this is when the same crop is grown year after year. This means that the same exact nutrients are being depleted from the soil year after year, and the soil will end up losing its fertility. Make sure we can describe some of these unsustainable agricultural practices that lead to soil degradation. So what we see is that in MEDCs, we're pretty good at avoiding unsustainable agricultural practices, but not so good in our LEDCs. We usually employ large-scale industrial agricultural practices, and these large industries have a knowledge of land management that aims for sustainable soil fertility and strives to avoid large-scale erosion. Even in MEDCs, we can see erosion continue to be a problem when we have a combination of warm, dry climate and intense farming practices. Next, we're going to move on and talk about soil conservation. We can take steps to reduce human impacts on soil fertility and or restore the soil to its pre-degraded state. So next, we're going to talk about a variety of measures that can be taken to conserve soil and soil nutrients. The first practice is the addition of soil conditioners. This often includes adding lime and other organic materials to the soil. The lime is often in the form of crushed limestone or chalk, and the purpose of this is to raise the pH and counter soil acidification. Soils can become acidic due to acid rain or dry acid particle deposition, as well as some soil processes such as nitrification and the respiration of organisms in the soil. Adding the lime to the soil can also increase the fertility of clay, and how it does this is it causes the tiny clay particles to stick together, and thus they start to act more like sand than clay. And we know that oftentimes when we have high clay content in our soils, it can trap moisture and not allow plants to extract the water and nutrients that they need. So once that clay can start to act a little bit more like sand, it can increase the fertility. Adding organic materials such as straw and manure or plowing it into fields can increase the amount of nutrients in the soil. And adding nutrients to soil in this manner is oftentimes better than simply adding fertilizers because the nutrients will be slowly released into the soil, and this slow release means that they can be better utilized by the plant. There's also steps that can be taken to attempt to reduce the effect of wind on an area, which can reduce the amount of wind erosion. Trees or bushes can be planted between fields, or short and tall crops can be alternated in adjacent fields. This also helps by reducing monoculturing, which we know can decrease the fertility of soil over time. Here's an example of wind reduction. This is something that's called a shelter belt. So this is some tall trees that have been planted between two fields. We can also utilize improved irrigation techniques, which can reduce evaporation of the irrigated water and also reduce salinization. In California fields, there's a lot of uncovered irrigation canals, and it's estimated that up to 50% of the water in these canals is lost before it even makes its way to the crops. So if these canals were covered, it would prevent evaporation of the water. Also, we could attempt to utilize more trickle flow irrigation. This is also called drip irrigation sometimes. This is where you've got small pipes or tubes that run through the fields, and there's tiny holes located periodically in these pipes. The water drips out slowly down into the ground, and it's taken in by the roots before it evaporates. Next, we've got a process called crop rotation. Different crops use different nutrients from the soil, and changing the type of crops each season can prevent the depletion of any single nutrient source. If the same exact type of crop is repeatedly planted in a location, it's going to take out the same exact nutrients every time. A good example of this is planting legumes, for example, peas or beans, after some other type of crop is planted, as these types of plants can actually add nitrogen back into the soil. Also, farmers can utilize something called a fallow year. A farmer might grow 3 years of crops in a location and then take a year where nothing is planted at all. And this is to allow the land to recover before another 3-year cycle of crops are planted. We should make sure we can describe some ways to increase the sustainability of soil. Lastly, we're going to take a look at some cultivation techniques that can be utilized by farmers to increase sustainability. Cultivation is a process by which a farmer will prepare the land for the growing of the crops. So a farmer can utilize a cultivation technique called cover cropping. Growing cover crops, which are fast-growing crops which cover the soil between the rows of main crops, can help keep the soil particles in place. You can see in this picture the main crop is growing between rows of taller crops. I believe these are corn plants. Next, we've got terracing. This is a method to reduce the steepness of slopes, and it replaces the slope with a series of flat terraces, and walls need to be built up on the outside of the terraces to keep the land in place. A common example of terracing is Asian wet rice fields. Similar to terracing is something called contour farming. This is a process where a farmer will plow and plant crops perpendicular to the slope of a hill. And we talked about previously how plowing parallel to the slope of a hill can increase water runoff by creating little channels that the water can flow through. So the contour farming will prevent the water from flowing downhill and also reduce water erosion. The problem with this method is that modern heavy machinery that's used in farming has a tendency to tip over when it's used parallel to the slope. Here you can see an example of contour farming. There's a hill here, and instead of plowing straight up and down it, the farmer has plowed perpendicular to the slope, so across the slope. We should make sure we can explain how sustainable cultivation techniques can help conserve our soil. All right, that one was a doozy. We've reached the end of the notes. Let's make sure that we don't forget to write our questions in the margin and our summary down there at the bottom.